André Derain was a French artist and a co-founder of the Fauvist art movement with Henri Matisse. Derain was known for his paintings of landscapes, portraits, and still lifes, as well as his sculpture and his stage and costume designs. Born in 1880 in Château, just outside Paris, Derain grew up in a middle-class family. His father, Louis Charlemagne, was a successful dairyman and ice cream maker, as well as a town councillor. André received a good education, but disliked school. His artistic abilities, especially in drawing, sculpture, and painting, impressed his classmates and instructors, and he won an award for drawing at school when he was 15. Derain began artistic studies with an old friend of his father's, together with his tutor's two sons. When he turned 18, he began to study engineering at the School of Mines in Paris. At the same time, he also studied painting at the Académie Camillo in Paris, under symbolist artist Eugène Carrière, until 1901. There was no regular instruction at the school, although Carrière visited it once a week. Derain met his lifelong friend and artistic collaborator Maurice de Vlaminck by accident. In June 1900, the railway carriage they were both travelling in was derailed. The pair walked on to Château, where both were living, and they became close friends. Vlaminck was largely a self-taught artist who rejected formal academic training, aside from some drawing lessons. He was an avid museum goer, and read widely. Vlaminck's artistic development was influenced by his experiences and interactions with other artists, rather than through structured education at an academy. In 1900, Derain and Vlaminck rented a disused restaurant in Château which they used as a studio, much to the disgust of their neighbors, who were often shocked by the pair's bohemian behavior. They reportedly shared models, as well as girlfriends. They began painting scenes together around their neighborhood, and developing their own distinct styles. They found that they shared an interest in vivid color, something that would become crucial on their path to what would later become Fauvism. André Derain met artist Henri Matisse when the painter arrived at Académie Camillo a few months after Derain. Although Matisse, who was older, is said to have been Derain's teacher, their relationship was more of a collaboration than a student-teacher role. Influenced by Matisse's bold style, the pair experimented with color and form in their paintings. While at the Academy, Derain spent most of his time in the Louvre, where his particular passion was the art of the early Renaissance, which he referred to as pure absolute painting. "I thought of nothing else," he said, "and went to see nothing else." Derain was extremely impressed by the Van Gogh retrospective at the Bernheim Jeune Gallery in 1901, and it was there that he introduced his two friends, Vlaminck and Matisse, to each other. That same year, Derain was called up for compulsory military service, a break in his work he bitterly regretted. "I am aware that the realist period in painting is over," he wrote to Vlaminck. "I believe that lines and colors are intimately related, and enjoy a parallel existence. Thus, if we keep working, we may find a field that is more real, and above all simpler to produce." While unable to create many works during his time with the army, Derain remained in touch with Vlaminck, writing to him often on the subject of art. In 1903, during his army service, he painted the boldly designed but still conservative The Ball at Suresnes, but he was not satisfied with his work. In a letter to Vlaminck he said, "All I am doing is paintings of officers. It's a frightful trial. What a lot of trouble to take over rubbish." After his release from the army in 1904, Derain's parents finally allowed their son to pursue his true love of art, rather than becoming an engineer. Derain enrolled at the Académie Julian in Paris, where he studied for a year. Derain's early works began to reflect a departure from traditional representation, towards a more expressive use of color. He often used dynamic brushwork that emphasized emotional expression over realistic representation. This portrait of his friend, which illustrates Derain's style at the time, may have been painted during one of their outings together. Derain began meeting with a group of artists who, like himself, were on a path of artistic exploration and evolution. Their desire for a more direct and emotionally charged form of art pushed them to explore new avenues of expression. They participated in exhibitions together, gradually solidifying their association. Venues like the Salon of the Independents and Berta Weil's Gallery became testing grounds for their evolving styles, including the bold use of color. Working with Vlaminck, Marquet, and Matisse, Derain began to treat color as an independent decorative and expressive element, thus freeing it from its traditional descriptive use. These early years were a period of intense artistic ferment, and a demonstration of early attempts to break free from a conventional color palette. In February 1905, Matisse introduced Derain to his art dealer, Ambroise Vollard. Vollard was deeply impressed with Derain's work and agreed to represent him. In March, Matisse, who was in charge of the hanging committee for the Paris Salon of the Independents exhibition, encouraged Derain to exhibit 8 of his paintings. As a result, Derain sold 4 of his works. In June 1905, Matisse wrote to Derain asking him to come to paint with him in the small fishing port of Collier. Derain's parents had been pressuring him to give up painting, so Matisse's invitation offered him a way of escape. Derain arrived in Collier in early July and stayed at the Station Hotel. The two artists started painting in a studio belonging to an artist friend who lived in the town. They worked intensely for 2 months, often comparing their points of view and sharing discoveries and reflections. Derain later said, "I knew moments of great doubt, and it was Matisse who reassured me." Working together, Derain's paintings began to exhibit a more relaxed and delicate quality. The amplified planes of color, saturated in light, were a key influence on Derain, leading to attempts to make shadows from color by representing areas of bright sun with vibrant tones of pigment. The two artists sketched the boats in the harbor, the fish market, and the nearby Pyrenees. They even made pictures of each other. Derain painted many different perspectives of the same locations, including the house they were using as a studio, the beach and the port, ultimately revealing the multifaceted nature of their surroundings. The clearly defined color units and solidly flattened background created an open kind of painting. This quality of openness, of a painting that spreads itself outward across the viewer's field of vision, characterizes the best of what was to become Fauvist art. They did not show Collier as it looked in real life. Instead, the artists began to convey the intensity and energy of Colliers' blazing sunlight by painting in dazzling colors. They both began to find a new freedom in creating art, using color to express their feelings about what they could see. This landscapes of bold, nearly acidic color, and relatively free handling of paint, with a variety of brushstrokes, was groundbreaking in its simplicity at the time. Derain began to apply pure color, straight from the tube, onto the white ground of his canvas in thick square dabs of the brush, giving the picture surface the appearance of a mosaic. With broken brushstrokes and impulsive lines, nature began to take on an appearance that reflected his sensations, rather than reality. The ways in which he abstracted his landscapes and figural scenes emphasized color as a conveyor of meaning in its own right. By the end of July, Derain began to leave pointillism behind, finding new forms of expression through the use of color, even though they were breaking all the rules on color harmony that had remained in place since the time of the Renaissance. "We became intoxicated with color," he said. "With words that described color, and with the sun, that made colors appear so bright." Both Derain and Matisse began to realize that the key to their success in using such exaggerated colors was that they had to simplify their drawings. If they intensified the quality of color for expressive effect, then they must reduce the detail used in drawing the shapes and forms of the picture. "Details," Matisse said, "lessen the purity of lines. They harm the emotional intensity. And we choose to reject that. The aim of painting is not to reflect history, but to express the artist's inner vision. Derain made around 30 paintings during his time in Collier, which were all purchased by Ambroise Vollard in the autumn of that year. He never returned after that summer, but Matisse went back several times, always attempting to capture the natural beauty of the place, but never feeling that he had succeeded. On his return from Collier, Derain began to apply the lessons he had learned earlier in the year to his latest works. In this painting, Derain depicts Matisse's wife Amélie in the elegant patterned Japanese kimono which she often wore. The abstracted background of greens and red serves to heighten the imposing presence of the sitter by the placement of large areas of unmodulated color side by side, achieving an illusion of depth. Later, in October of that year, Derain exhibited at the Autumn Salon at the Grand Palais in Paris. Derain, Matisse, Lemonque and their friends had their highly colored paintings hung together as a group by the exhibition organizers. Much of the other art on display at the exhibition, which included retrospectives of works by Manet and Ingres, were far from shocking, even when judged by early 20th century standards. By contrast, the orgy of primary and complementary colors on display in the room where Derain was displayed shocked the viewers. One art critic described the scene. In the center of the room stands a small sculpture of a child's torso, in the neo-Renaissance style. The honesty of this bust is surprising, amidst the orgy of pure tones that surround it. It is a Donatello among the wild beasts. In French, the word for wild beasts is fauve, and the name stuck. The artists later decided to call their colorist movement fauvism, a name that it retains to this day. The paintings on exhibit were so violently bright in their color choices, and primitive in their brush strokes, that even sophisticated European art connoisseurs, who had earlier absorbed the innovations of Impressionism, were shocked. The perceived wildness lay in the lurid colors and aggressive execution each of the artists had used. Derain's self-portrait has half the face in green, while Matisse's portrait of his wife, Woman in a Hat, showed her with a face blotched with green, pink and yellow, under a hairdo in brick red and cobalt blue, as well as a giant purple hat, with multicolored feathers. And the trees and foreground in Maurice de Lemonque's landscapes were blazing orange. The critics described the artists as using their colors as if they were sticks of dynamite. Fauvism was the first avant-garde art movement of the 20th century, even though it had no agenda, no manifesto, and no decided set of aesthetics. It was just a group of friends, with similar thoughts about painting, and a strong belief in the expressive power of pure color to evoke emotional feeling. Their work attracted buyers' attention at the Salon, and were almost all sold to collectors during the exhibition. But not everyone agreed. One critic referred to their paintings as pots of colors, flung in the public's face. Another spoke of the uncouth and naive games of a child playing with a box of colors. He claimed that their work had nothing at all to do with art. In November 1905, Ambroise Vollard bought the contents of Derain's studio for 3,300 francs, giving him the means to continue his career. The purchase consisted of 89 paintings and 80 works on paper. After discovering the series of paintings Derain had created in Collier, his work became highly revered within his artistic circle. Derain himself believed that Fauvism was the answer to his search for a permanent artistic form, and continued to experiment with color in his work. Derain paid great attention to light in his paintings, but he created it by means of color. In this painting, shadow and darkness is created by using a more intense color. Although the light seems to be natural, it is created by color and contrast. The blue tones on the red trees are the shadows of the overhead foliage. Despite the fact that the colors are mainly complementary and not compatible, the contrasted areas create a unique landscape full of life. Derain used bright colors here to show his emotions and mood, making color the most persuasive element of his art. Fauvism developed from a wide variety of sources, including post-impressionism and neo-impressionism. But it was artist Paul Gauguin, whose employment of areas of saturated color, particularly in paintings from Tahiti, who strongly influenced Derain's work. Like Gauguin, Derain uses simplified forms and unmodulated areas of bright color in this painting in a composition that emphasizes its flat, decorative qualities. The subject is visibly exotic, with nude and partially nude women displayed in a fantastic landscape. The scarlet macaw and green snake suggest a Garden of Eden, where humans live in harmony with nature. The theme of the picture closely follows the work of Gauguin, who famously traveled to the South Seas in the 1880s to find a purer expression of life in nature. Derain's painting The Dancer shares a great deal with the post-impressionist interest in capturing a slice of modern life in Paris. Her pose, with crossed legs, and upper body leaning forward, with that alluring and powerful gaze, raises the question of whether the figure was only a dancer, or actually something else entirely. Derain's portrait is painted with extremely vibrant, unnatural colors. He uses heavy outlines to suggest volume, and the figure's facial features, and arms and legs are elongated and simplified. The surface of the canvas is built up with thickly applied patches of paint, juxtaposed one beside the other, creating a vibrant, decorative effect. In 3 trips to London between March 1906 and February 1907, André Derain, who was commissioned by Art de l'Amboise Vollard, worked to reproduce a series of earlier paintings of the city by Claude Monet. Whereas Monet had painted London through the haze of its rising blue-grey mist and smog, Derain's works are exhilaratingly bright. They are multicolored views of the city showered in golden light, or constructed using bold contrasts of color. In 30 paintings, he presented a portrait of London that was radically different from anything done before. He chose a variety of London subjects, including emblematic views of historical sites, such as the Palace of Westminster, and activity in the city's parks and great streets. Like Monet before him, he concentrated on the river, producing no less than 6 views of Tower Bridge, one of the most popular tourist attractions in the city. Derain was also fascinated by the working life of the river, particularly the Pool of London, with its busy international commercial traffic, wharves and industry. In these works, Derain managed to balance the expressive and descriptive qualities of color. He used the conflict between warm and cool colors to convey the noise and activities of the busy dockyard. Many of his London paintings may have been executed from sketchbooks after Derain returned to Paris. Among the artist's 29 known scenes, the most striking are those of the Thames, in which he gave free rein to color, inventing red boats, and painting the water green and yellow, and the sky orange. In this view of Regent Street near Oxford Circle, his palette is more restrained, consisting primarily of subdued blues and strategically placed scarlets. Contemporary photographs of Regent Street show that Derain did not exaggerate. The street and sidewalks were jammed, the population of the city having reached nearly 400,000 at that time. Houses of Parliament represents a neo-impressionist panoramic view of the Thames. Derain wrote that he had difficulty with the subject. It was absurd to paint the blazing sun in the world capital of fog, yet he took advantage of this opportunity to explore the notion of color as an independent entity, and paint a landscape which no longer represents anything. An illusion of depth in the painting is created by using stronger and warmer tones in the foreground, which slowly become weaker and cooler towards the back. The drawing of the image is characteristically simplified into shapes and forms whose details are conveyed by unmodified brushstrokes of almost the same size. This gives the painting an overall harmony that you would not expect in a composition of such conflicting colors. Vollard bought Derain's London series in its entirety, 30 paintings in total, of which 29 are known today. But he did not exhibit them as a group. More recently, in 2005, the Courtauld Gallery in London, displayed 12 of the major paintings from the series in their exhibition André Derain, the London Paintings. The exhibition also showed some of Derain's sketchbooks and letters. In 1906, with the Fauvist movement solidified, Derain began to be offered significant commissions, and he experimented even more freely, synthesizing the chromatic richness of Fauvism with the fragmentation of pointillism, working in a somewhat divisionist manner. He confessed of Lemonque, "I believe that I am now moving towards something better, where the picturesque matters less than it did last year. If we are not looking for decoration, we can simplify, more and more." Derain painted many landscapes and still lifes in this style. The distinguishing features of the works of this period are strict geometric forms, and the volume and harmony of the images. Colors also started to become softer. Here we begin to see a pivotal change in Derain's career. He appears to hesitate between an abstracted aesthetic, concentrating on emotional values, and more representational works, which he feared would look predetermined. This anxiety proved to be fruitful, producing a series of landscapes of extraordinary color and structural harmony, where Derain revels in shape and color, rendered with dazzling effect. In early 1906, Derain began to move away from the radical character of Fauvism, intending to explore new reflections on compositions. He began to purify his view of nature, reducing his use of color to red, blue and yellow primary values. The space and the image are very clear, using minimal means. In 1906, Fauvism was seen as the ultimate refinement in French painting, and another reminder that Paris remained the unquestioned center of world art. However, by 1907, the real novelty and enthusiasm of the movement was over, even though the Fauvist style still influenced a number of visiting artists from Belgium, Holland, Poland, and Russia. It also continued to have a major impact on the Expressionist movement, which was beginning to emerge in Germany. For most artists, Fauvism was a transitional learning stage. By 1908, a revived interest in Paul Cézanne's vision of the order and structure of nature had led many of them to reject the turbulent emotionalism of Fauvism in favor of the logic of Cubism. Artist Kees van Dongen joined the Expressionist group in Dresden, and Braque became the co-founder with Picasso of Cubism. Derain, after a brief flirtation with Cubism, became a widely popular painter in a somewhat neoclassical manner. Matisse alone pursued the course he had pioneered, achieving a sophisticated balance between his own emotions and the world he painted. After de l'Amboise Vollard purchased the entire contents of Derain's studio in 1907, the artist was financially secure, and able to develop a contemporary interest in primitivism in his paintings and sculptures. In 1906, André Derain met artist Pablo Picasso. The following year, Derain moved to Montmartre and rented a studio there, which was close to his artist friends. He shared with them his new interest in primitive art, which influenced his own stone sculptures at the time. While in Montmartre, Derain lived with and then married Alice Prince. Alice had been introduced to the Montmartre artists' circle by Picasso, and she had made an immediate impact as his model, muse and mistress. Her angelic features and risque behavior made her the perfect subject for Picasso's work of the period, and, even though she was married, she shared her favors with many of the artists in their group whenever the mood took her. It was Picasso that introduced Alice to Derain, expecting the two to have an affair. Instead, their meeting sparked off a whirlwind romance which resulted in Alice divorcing her husband and marrying Derain in what was to become a long-term relationship. Alice remained married to him for the next 45 years, until the artist's death in 1954. While their love affair started in a blaze of passion, it became strained over time. Derain fathered an illegitimate child with another woman during their life together, which brought bitterness to their marriage. In 1906, André Derain and Pablo Picasso visited the Ethnographic Museum at the Trocadero in Paris together, and examined at close quarters many examples of what they termed primitive art. Derain's interest in African masks had begun earlier, after viewing examples in the anthropological collection of the British Museum. He became an amateur collector of African sculpture, and was one of the first Montmartre artists to use these influences in his art. Many of these objects are visible in photographs of his studio taken in 1914. It is likely that Derain was responsible for raising the interest in his friends Picasso and Braque in primitive art, both of whom then went on to develop Cubism. Picasso later recalled his visit with Derain was a revelation, which, it turned out, had an immediate effect on his art. Toward the end of the year, Picasso began work on a large composition, The Young Ladies of Avignon. The Avignon in the title referred to Avignon Street in Barcelona, a popular red-light district for sailors. The women in the painting were not conventional images of beauty, but 5 nude prostitutes. The Young Ladies of Avignon was such a revolutionary concept at the time that the painting was rejected, even by avant-garde painters and critics. When Picasso showed the painting to acquaintances in his studio later, the nearly universal reaction was shock and revulsion. His friend Henri Matisse angrily dismissed the work as a hoax. André Derain was even more horrified. "This can only end in suicide," he said. "One day Picasso will be found hanging on the wall behind the painting." Because of the negative reaction, Picasso rolled up the canvas and kept it out of sight. It was bought in the early 1920s by a gallery owner, sight unseen. It remained relatively unknown until 1937, when it was shown at the Petit Palais in Paris. The New York Museum of Modern Art bought it soon afterwards, and in later years it became a prized part of their collection. It has become one of the most important paintings of the 20th century. After 1907, now under the influence of Picasso's Cubism, and the paintings of Paul Cézanne, Derain began to shift from the brilliant Fauvist palette he had been using to more muted tones. He began to paint simpler geometric forms, with more neutral colors, seeking to create a synthesis between classicism and modernity. An example is Road to Cassis, painted in 1907, after a summer he spent in the town. It shows Derain's interest in synthesizing and simplifying his compositions, while capturing the energy and vigor of the surrounding landscape. In his figurative works at the time, Derain began to fuse Cézanne's methods of creating volume, with the flatness and rhythmic design of non-Western sculpture, such as in this painting, Bathers. It focuses on a popular subject, the nude female figure bathing in nature, earlier depicted by both Cézanne and Picasso. In this work Derain merges the instinctive quality of primitivism with Cézanne's constructivism in order to create a timeless art, removed from any identifiable everyday reality. The influence of African sculpture is evident in the expressive and primitive facial features of the women. The delineation of their bodies, deconstructed and reduced to geometric forms, highlights his interest in Cubism at the time. These influences also began to appear in his sculptures, such as the archaic, crouching man, and the gracefully totemic, standing nude, both created in 1907. In the same year, Derain attracted the attention of Daniel Canveiler, who was Picasso's art dealer. Derain signed a contract with him, and Canveiler purchased the contents of Derain's studio. Canveiler remained a tireless advocate of Derain's work until 1922. Unlike artists like Picasso or Matisse, who followed clearer artistic trajectories, André Derain was more unpredictable, always attempting to explore different styles and approaches. While this contributed to his artistic merit, it may also have prevented him from becoming as widely recognized as some of his contemporaries. In 1908, wanting to change direction, Derain destroyed much of his body of unsold figurative paintings, and became increasingly influenced by the style of Paul Cézanne. He concentrated on a series of landscapes and still lifes, based on Cézanne's geometric approach. These works resulted in a modern rendering of traditional genres and subject matter, while reflecting influences of the past. During these years he involved himself with the theories of the Cubists, but only practiced a limited form of it for a short time. He experimented with different ways of rendering forms within the same work, sometimes using sharp outlines, and at other times suggesting edges through color variations. Around 1911, Derain was attracted by Italian and French primitive masters. He also admired the primitive art of Henri Rousseau. This was to become what is known as Derain's Gothic period, using austere forms and muted colors instead of the bright pure colors of Fauvism. Always questioning his position, Derain never adopted one style for very long. Unlike Picasso, Derain moved gradually towards a more restrained, more academic position, endlessly seeking a visual language that would demonstrate a connection to the great works of the past. In 1912, he exhibited with the Blue Rider Group in Germany, and the following year, at the Armory Show in New York. Derain believed that art shouldn't need context to be of value, and that it should have meaning for any generation. By 1913, late Gothic and early Renaissance themes began to appear in his paintings, such as the pseudo-religious Saturday. He began to focus more on the beauty of what he was describing on the canvas, and works such as The Italian Woman, shown here, demonstrate his increasingly stark and geometric classicism. His continued interest in Cézanne resulted in a series of landscapes which resemble Cézanne's style, such as Landscape at Cadaqués painted in 1913. Turning to figurative work, Derain's portrait of Spanish painter Francisco Torino combines various sources of inspiration with amazing economy. It has the enigmatic melancholy and darkness of Spanish paintings by Goya, while the elongated body and hands suggest the mannerism of El Greco. When World War I was declared in 1914, Derain was with Picasso and Braque near Avignon. He was mobilized for military service, and until his release in 1919 he had little time for painting. Derain joined an artillery unit, and served in Champagne, the Somme and Verdun. Derain wrote to Vlaminck from the front in 1917. "I paint only in my imagination. I would like to do nothing but portraits, real portraits, with hands and hair, the whole of life." In a letter to Alice in 1918 he said, "I had always thought that a war would do everything for me, but I don't think I'm up to it. This daily uneventful grind is really terrible, something I'll never understand." Derain's first solo exhibition, which took place at the Galerie Paul Guillaume in Paris in 1916 while he was still at the front, was accompanied by a text by poet Guillaume Apollinaire. Derain held very few solo exhibitions. Only 3 more ever held in Paris, in 1931, 1937 and 1949. The terrible events of World War I not only changed the world in terms of geopolitics, warfare and technology, but also had a powerful effect on developments in the world of art. Many of Europe's most inventive artists, shaken by the horrors and uncertainty of war, gave up their innovative styles and retreated to the safer position of working traditionally in a movement known as the Return to Order. Derain survived the war, but he was not unscathed. He returned to realism and distanced himself from experimental avant-gardism. He moved away from the bold colors and his interest in geometric shapes, and adopted softer tones and more fluid forms. From then on, his work seems proficient, but dull. By the 1920s, his paintings of nudes, still lifes and portraits had become increasingly neoclassical, and the spontaneity and impulsiveness that had distinguished his earlier work gradually disappeared. His art changed little after the 1920s, though his conservative style brought him financial success. He won new acclaim as a leader of the renewed classicism and was admired as an upholder of tradition. He remained devoted to his own topics, but also carried out figure compositions and flower arrangements. Leading critics in the 1920s considered Derain to be an outstanding French avant-garde painter and the upholder of the classical spirit of French tradition. Throughout the 1920s, he created his well-known paintings of performers and dancers, including the large-scale work, Harlequin and Pierrot. In 1923, Derain entered into an exclusive agreement with the Paul Guillaume Gallery. Now that he was represented by three prominent dealers, Vollard, Canveiler, and Guillaume, Derain had the financial stability to work freely on any projects he chose, and to assemble the diverse collection of modern paintings, sculpture, and ethnographic objects that filled his Paris home and studios. The 1920s marked the height of Derain's success. In 1928, he was awarded the Carnegie Prize by the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for his painting titled Still Life with Dead Game. He began to exhibit extensively abroad, in London, Berlin, Frankfurt, Dusseldorf, and New York City. In 1929, he built a house studio in Paris, opposite Braque's house. In 1931, his works were shown at an exhibition at the Paul Guillaume Gallery. By the late 1920s, the price of Derain's paintings had risen to 87,000 francs. A celebrated figure of the Roaring Twenties, he lived the life of a playboy, collecting Bugatti racing cars, French chateaux and attracting women companions. For all his exhibitionism, he was astonishingly practical. He liked repairing cars, practicing music, playing the piano or the organ, building model planes or drawing tarot cards. But some critics saw him as a whimsical, indecisive jack of all trades. In 1931, a book of essays titled For and Against Derain featured an essay by one critic denouncing the artist's newly adopted style. "Youth has departed," he said. "What remains is a highly intellectual and rather mechanical art." For his supporters, Derain became the representative of classic French realist painting. His palette was characterized by brown and black colors. His still lifes and female nudes evoked Courbet, his landscapes, the school of Barbizon. He was described as the greatest living French painter, and praised by art critics throughout France. In 1935, Derain was given a retrospective in Bern, Switzerland. He was also included in the Exhibition of Independent Artists in 1937. Acknowledged in all the major art centers, Derain benefited from a great deal of exposure, as at the 1937 Universal Exhibition, where he was given an entire room for his work, and in New York, Bern and on the other side of the Rhine, where several exhibitions were devoted to him. This study for Derain's 1906 painting The Dance was Derain's earliest involvement with the subject of dance and the stage. It resulted from his visit to the Colonial Exhibition in Marseille in 1905, where he witnessed a performance by Cambodian dancers. The subject fueled Derain's imagination, resulting in him creating a series of works with dance as their central theme. Much later, in 1919, the director of the Ballets Russes, Sergei Diaghilev, commissioned Derain to create the sets, costumes and curtain for his ballet The Magic Toy Shop, presented at the Alhambra in London in June of that year. It was a major success, and the beginning of a career for Derain as a stage and costume designer. Between 1918 and 1953, Derain designed sets and costumes for no fewer than 13 ballets, 2 operas and 2 plays, including 6 productions for the Ballets Russes under Sergei Diaghilev and Georges Balanchine in Paris, London, and New York. He continued his involvement in ballet and set design after the Second World War into the 1950s, designing sets and costumes for La Valse in 1950, sets and costumes for Mozart's Il Seraglio in 1951, and design for Rossini's Barber of Seville in Aix-en-Provence in 1953. In 1935, Derain sold his properties and bought a large 17th-century house at Chambourcy, 25 kilometers northwest of Paris. The estate included ponds and waterfalls, immense trees over 100 years old, an abandoned tennis court, a little Japanese folly, an orchard, a vegetable garden, a greenhouse and roses, and an orangery, where he painted his large format works. He set up his studio on the first floor of the house, in a room with a double opening onto the courtyard and the park, giving access to the terrace. He lived there with his wife Alice, her sister, and his niece Genevieve. He also maintained a small flat in Paris, which served several purposes. He found it difficult to find good models at Chambourcy, and the Paris flat also provided a convenient place for him to meet his mistresses. He continued to paint and exhibit intermittently, but distanced himself from the artistic scene in Paris. Fascinated by the world's civilizations, it was in Chambourcy that Derain built up a vast collection of books, which are now exhibited in the world's greatest museums. The Painter and His Family, painted by André Derain in 1939, is more than a family portrait, it is an allegorical representation of the life of an artist. In the painting, Derain surrounded himself with female family members and pets. Derain is working at his easel, while his wife Alice reads a book in the foreground. Alice's sister Suzanne is seen in the background holding a tray, while her daughter Genevieve is behind the artist holding a small dog. Suzanne and Genevieve were an intimate part of Derain's family circle. The two lived with the Derains from 1928, and in 1935, they moved to Chambourcy, where they lived across the courtyard from Derain and Alice. Derain treated Genevieve as his own daughter, and painted her many times. He had no children with Alice, however in 1939 his mistress, Raymond Norbelich, gave birth to a boy they called Bobby. The boy was recognized by Derain as his son, and later adopted by Derain's wife Alice and named André Charlemagne Derain. On the 3rd of September 1939, 2 days after the German invasion of Poland, France declared war on Nazi Germany. The Germans advanced rapidly, and Paris fell in June 1940. During the exodus, Derain fled with his family to the south of France, before returning in 1941. When he found his Chambourcy home was occupied, and had been looted by the German army, Derain moved to Paris where he rented a flat and settled with Alice. He also established nearby accommodation for his model and mistress, Raymond Norbelich. Unwilling to become involved in the French occupation government's art policy, Derain refused all invitations to major exhibitions in Parisian art galleries throughout the war. He did however continue to exhibit abroad, such as at the Pierre Matisse Gallery in New York. The German government, recognizing Derain's high standing in the French art world, did its best to attract him to support their cause. He was offered the post of director of the School of Fine Arts, but he refused. He also rejected an official commission to paint the family of Hitler's foreign minister, von Ribbentrop. However, in exchange for the promise of the release of French prisoners, and the return of his house in Chambourcy, Derain did accept an invitation to visit Germany in 1941. He traveled with other French artists to Cologne to attend a Nazi exhibition of artist Arno Breker's sculptures. The German propaganda machine made much of Derain's presence in the Reich. In 1942, Derain attended a second Arno Breker exhibition, held in Paris at the Orangery. Derain was among the notable personalities present at the opening ceremony, which included other prominent artists and figures of the time. At the end of the war, his official visit to Nazi Germany caused a scandal, both in Parisian circles and in the rest of France. Derain was accused of collaboration with the Nazis because of his participation in the 1941 trip. In October 1944, a group of fellow artists, acting as judges, met under the chairmanship of Pablo Picasso. Derain was cleared of the charges against him, however a year later, the National Committee of Artists set up by the public authorities banned Derain from exhibiting professionally for a year. Derain would not accept the verdict, and while his reputation never recovered, he continued to live in his home in Chambord with his wife, his adopted son, his sister-in-law, his niece and her husband and children. In the years before his death, he lived practically forgotten in his country home. The retrospective exhibition in Paris in 1937 was the climax of his fame. In 1953, Derain contracted an eye infection from which he never fully recovered. His wife made an attempt to seize control of his finances. As soon as he was well again, he left Alice, but the break was short-lived, because in 1954 he was knocked down by a truck in Chambord. He wasn't seriously injured, but the shock was too much for a man in his 70s. He did not recover and died later in September 1954, but not before making an official reconciliation with his wife. The artist's son, Bobby, inherited 3/4 of the contents of Derain's studio at the time of his death. In a strange twist, following Bobby's own death in 1996, the collection passed to Bobby's mother, Derain's model and mistress, Raymonde Norbelich. Despite his vibrant Fauvist paintings and notable sculptures, André Derain often remained underappreciated by the art world. He had only a few exhibitions in Paris during the latter part of his career. He faced criticism from both avant-garde and traditionalist circles during his lifetime, and his work after World War I received mixed reviews. Some viewed it as an anticlimax, while others recognized Derain's unique ability to blend the traditions of French culture with contemporary influences. In recent years, Derain's works have fetched high prices at auctions, reflecting a growing recognition of his importance in 20th-century art. His painting, Matisse in Terrace, sold for $3.5 million in 2024, highlighting the enduring value of his contributions to the art world. His works are exhibited in museums across the world.